Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that'll break your heart. Because the boy who saved an entire town from starving to death during the worst winter Dakota Territory ever saw didn't live long enough to know he'd become famous. He died at 26, killed by the very machine that was supposed to make frontier life easier. And the woman who made him immortal in her books never got to tell him that children would read his name and remember his courage for the next 140 years. You're standing on Main Street in Smet, Dakota Territory, in February of 1881. The temperature is 35 below zero. The wind isn't blowing, it's screaming. And somewhere in the white chaos that used to be a prairie town, a 16-year-old boy named Oscar Edmund Garland is about to risk his life to save yours. They call him Cap. Nobody remembers why. Maybe it's short for Captain. Maybe it's a childhood nickname that stuck. But that's what everyone knows him as. Cap Garland. The kid with the easy smile and the steady hands. The one who can calm a spooked horse with just his voice. The one who never complains about the cold, even though his coat is too thin and his boots are held together with wire. He's not supposed to be a hero. He's just a farmer's son. One of dozens of teenagers scattered across homestead claims, learning how to survive in a place where winter doesn't just arrive. It attacks. But tonight, Cap Garland is standing in Fuller's Hardware with Almanzo Wilder, and they're about to make a decision that'll define both of their lives, because the town is starving. The train stopped running in January when blizzards buried the tracks under 15-foot drifts. The merchants have sold almost everything. Families are grinding their last handfuls of wheat and wondering if they'll live to see spring. And Cap just heard a rumour. A settler 12 miles south might have wheat. 60 bushels, maybe more. Enough to keep 40 families alive until the railroad clears the tracks. The problem is getting there. 12 miles in this weather means death if you get lost. Means freezing if your horse gives out. Means gambling your life on the chance that the rumour is true and the settler will sell and you can find your way home before the next blizzard hits. Almanzo is older, 24. He's got good horses and better judgment. He's the one proposing this trip. The one volunteering to risk his neck for neighbours who might not even remember his name if he survives. And Cap? Cap's 16. Still growing. Still figuring out who he's going to be. But he's not hesitating, because that's not how you survive on the frontier. You don't wait for permission. You don't calculate odds. You see your community dying and you do something about it. Laura Ingalls is watching from across the store. She's 13. Small for her age. Her family has been rationing food for weeks. Her father's hands shake when he twists hay for the stove because he's burning more calories than he's eating. Her mother measures flour in spoonfuls instead of cups. Her little sister Grace cries from hunger in the middle of the night. And this boy, this teenager who should be worrying about learning to dance or courting girls or all the normal things 16-year-olds think about. This boy is volunteering to ride into a blizzard that killed 2 men last week. That buried the Johnson homestead so deep they had to dig a tunnel from their door to their barn. That makes grown men stay inside and pray for spring. You need to understand what that means, what Cap Garland is choosing. Because 60 years from now, Laura Ingalls Wilder will write a book called The Long Winter, and she'll make Almanzo the hero. She'll describe the wheat ride in beautiful detail. She'll make it into legend. But she'll barely mention Cap's name, won't explain who he was or why he mattered, won't tell you that the boy riding beside Almanzo was somebody's son, somebody's brother. Somebody's friend who deserved better than to become a footnote in someone else's story. And she definitely won't tell you what happened 10 years later. How Cap Garland survived the long winter only to die in an explosion so brutal that his mother had to watch him spend his last hours in agony. How the machine that killed him was supposed to represent progress. How the boy who rode through blizzards didn't survive the peace that followed. But that tragedy is 10 years away. Right now, in February of 1881, Cap Garland is just a kid making a choice. The kind of choice that separates heroes from survivors. He looks at Almanzo, nods once, and just like that it's decided. They'll leave at dawn, take Almanzo's horses, follow the wagon roads as long as they can, and then trust instinct and prayer to guide them home. The men in Fuller's Hardware don't try to stop them. Don't argue. Don't suggest someone else should go. Because on the frontier you don't question courage. You just witness it, remember it, and hope you never have to match it. Laura's father, Charles Ingalls, steps forward. He's gaunt, exhausted. His face has gone hollow from weeks of starvation rations, but he shakes both their hands, firm, deliberate, the kind of handshake that says, "I see what you're doing, I know what it costs, and if you don't come back, I'll remember you were brave." That's the contract. That's the deal frontier communities make with their young men. We'll let you risk your life. We'll celebrate if you succeed. And if you die, we'll call it heroic instead of preventable. The blizzard hits at noon. You're in your homestead shack, listening to the wind try to tear your roof off. The windows are covered in frost so thick you can't see through them. The temperature inside is barely above freezing, even though your stove is burning twisted hay as fast as you can feed it. And you're thinking about two boys on horses somewhere out there in the white chaos. Cap Garland left before dawn. You watched from your window as he and Almanzo rode south, their horses' breath freezing in clouds around their heads. They were bundled in every piece of clothing they owned. Scarves wrapped around their faces, mittens over gloves, feet wrapped in burlap inside their boots to trap whatever warmth their bodies could generate. They look small against the prairie, two dark shapes on a landscape that wants everyone dead. The wind shifts. Now it's coming from the northwest. That's the killing wind, the one that drops temperatures 20 degrees in 20 minutes, the one that creates whiteout conditions so complete you can't see your hand in front of your face, the one that's killed more settlers than disease and accidents combined. And Cap Garland is out there somewhere, 16 years old, riding through conditions that would make grown men turn back, betting his life that he can find wheat and bring it home before his body gives up and the cold claims him. You need to understand who this boy is, where he came from, why he's willing to die for neighbours who might not even know his full name. Oscar Edmund Garland was born December 27th, 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War, in the middle of the country's transformation from a collection of states into something bigger. Something that required people to settle land and build towns and prove that civilization could survive anywhere if you were tough enough. His family came to Dakota Territory chasing the same dream everyone else was chasing: free land, fresh start, the promise that hard work would equal prosperity. They filed a homestead claim near Smet, built a shack, planted wheat, and waited to see if the prairie would let them stay. Cap grew up working. That's what frontier children did. You didn't have childhood the way modern kids understand it. You had chores, responsibilities, the knowledge that your family's survival depended on everyone contributing every single day. By the time he was 10, Cap could handle horses better than most grown men, could read weather by watching how animals behaved, could walk 3 miles through snow to check on neighbours because that's what you did when isolation could kill, and community was the only thing standing between you and death. His sister Florence was different, older, smarter in the book-learning way that impressed settlers who wanted their children to rise above farm labour. She became Smet's first teacher, set up a school in a back room and taught reading and arithmetic to children whose parents could barely sign their own names. Florence represented one version of the frontier, the civilizing influence, the future where education mattered and women could have professions and towns had institutions instead of just survival. But Cap represented something else, the physical labour, the dangerous work. The masculine ideal where you proved yourself through courage and endurance and willingness to risk everything when your community needed you. Both versions mattered. Both were necessary, but only one left you dead at 26. The blizzard lasts 18 hours. When it finally stops, the world has changed again. The drifts are taller, the cold is deeper, and you're standing in your doorway staring south, wondering if Cap Garland is alive. The answer comes 2 days later, February 12th. You hear the commotion before you see them. Voices shouting, people running through snow that should be too deep for running, and then you see them, Almanzo and Cap, on horses that look half dead from exhaustion, leading a sled piled with sacks of wheat, 60 bushels. They found it. They bought it. They brought it home. The town gathers. Everyone who can walk makes their way to Main Street. You're all gaunt, exhausted. wearing clothes that haven't been properly washed in months because water is too precious and fuel is too scarce. But you're there, witnessing, recording this moment in collective memory. Cap Garland climbs down from his horse. He's frozen, literally frozen. His coat has ice crusted on it. His face is raw from windburn. His hands are shaking so hard he can't untie the ropes holding the wheat sacks. But he's smiling, that easy smile, the one that says, "It's fine, we made it. Nobody needs to make a fuss, except everyone is making a fuss. Women are crying, men are shaking Almanzo's hand and pounding Cap's back. Children are staring at these two like they're legends made flesh." And Laura Ingalls is standing at the edge of the crowd, watching Cap Garland with those sharp eyes that miss nothing. She's recording this moment, burning it into memory, because someday she'll be a writer, someday she'll tell this story, someday she'll make Cap Garland famous. But right now she's just a 13-year-old girl watching a boy become a hero, watching him save her family, watching him do something she'll never forget. What she doesn't know, what nobody knows, what Cap himself can't possibly imagine, is that this moment of glory will be followed by 10 years of ordinary life, and then a death so sudden and brutal that it'll make you question whether survival is ever really guaranteed. The wheat saves de Smet. Not immediately, not magically, but it buys time, buys hope. Buys the weeks they need to survive until the trains start running again and civilization reconnects with this isolated town that almost died. Families grind the wheat in coffee mills, make bread so coarse it's barely edible, but it's food, it's calories, it's the difference between starvation and survival. Cap Garland doesn't ask for payment, doesn't demand recognition, doesn't use his heroism as leverage for anything. He just goes back to his family's homestead, back to twisting hay and rationing meals and enduring the same grinding poverty everyone else is enduring. Because that's the thing about frontier heroism. It doesn't change your circumstances, doesn't make you wealthy or comfortable or safe. You're still the same person living the same hard life. You just did something brave once, and now you get to keep surviving. The trains finally break through in early May. The whole town walks to the depot to watch the first locomotive arrive. It's decorated with evergreen branches. The engineer is grinning, and when the cargo doors open, you see barrels of flour and sacks of sugar and coffee and fresh vegetables and oranges. Actual oranges in May in Dakota Territory. Someone starts singing. A hymn. Thanksgiving. The whole crowd joins in, and you're crying. Everyone's crying, because you survived. 40 families made it through 7 months of winter that wanted everyone dead, and Cap Garland is part of the reason why. Laura's father buys oranges. 3 of them. They cost more than wheat cost during the crisis, but he doesn't care. He watches his daughters taste fresh fruit for the first time in 7 months, and his face does something it hasn't done since October. He smiles. The town celebrates what they start calling Christmas in May. There's a dance at the Congregational Church. Real dancing with fiddles and laughter and the kind of joy that only comes from surviving something that should have killed you. Cap is there. 17 now. Still growing into the man he'll become. He's awkward at dances. Not good with small talk. Better with horses than humans. But he's there. Part of the community he helped save. And Laura is watching. Always watching. Recording details she'll use decades later when she sits down to write about the hard winter and the wheat ride and the boy named Cap Garland who deserved better than history gave him. The summer of 1881 is beautiful. The prairie blooms. Wheat grows tall and golden. The town expands. New families arrive. More buildings go up. De Smet starts to look less like a collection of desperate survivors and more like an actual town. Cap works. That's what young men do. He helps with harvest, learns the rhythms of agricultural labour, discovers he's good with machinery, good with the new steam-powered equipment that's starting to replace manual threshing. Steam threshers are revolutionary. They can process in days what used to take weeks. Turn wheat into cash crops fast enough that farmers can actually make money instead of just surviving. They're loud and dangerous and expensive, but they represent progress, the future. The promise that the frontier will eventually become civilization and all the suffering will have been worth it. Cap learns to operate these machines, learns to read steam pressure, and adjust valves and keep the boilers from overheating. It's skilled work, important work, the kind of job that pays better than simple farm labour. It's also the kind of work that kills you if you make a mistake, or if the equipment malfunctions, or if someone cuts corners on maintenance because schedules are tight and money is scarce and the wheat needs to be threshed before weather ruins it. But that danger is years away. Right now, in the summer of 1881, Cap Garland is just a boy learning a trade, building a life, becoming the man he'll be for exactly 10 more years. The seasons cycle, fall arrives, winter comes again. But it's nothing like the long winter. This is normal winter, manageable winter, the kind you can survive without heroism. Cap turns 18, 19, 20. He's filling out, growing into his frame. He's still got that easy smile, still good with horses, still the kind of person neighbours trust, the kind of young man who helps fix your roof without asking for payment, who checks on elderly homesteaders during storms, who embodies all the frontier values that make communities functional. His sister Florence marries, moves to her own homestead, continues teaching. The Garland family is establishing itself, becoming one of de Smet's stable families, the kind that will be here for generations, except they won't be. Because in November of 1891, something will break. A boiler will explode. And Cap Garland will die in a field with both legs shattered and his body scalded by superheated steam. And his mother will hold him while he spends his last hours in agony. But tonight, in this moment, Cap Garland is alive. He's 20. He's got 6 years left. 6 years of ordinary life before tragedy finds him. And nobody knows. Nobody suspects. Because how could you? How could anyone guess that the boy who survived the long winter would be killed by the very progress he helped make possible? The summer after the long winter, Cap Garland turned 17. And just like that, heroism became a memory. Something that happened once. Something people mentioned when they passed him on the street, but didn't change the daily reality of survival on the Dakota Prairie. You need to understand what happens after you save a town. You wake up the next morning and your family still needs food. Your father still needs help with the wheat harvest. Your clothes are still worn through. Your boots still leak. Being a hero doesn't pay the bills, doesn't make winter easier, doesn't change the fact that you're 17 years old in a territory where 17 means you're a man with a man's responsibilities and none of a man's wages. Cap worked. That's what young men did in 1881 if they wanted to eat. He hired himself out to neighbouring farms during harvest season. Learned to swing a scythe for 12 hours without stopping. Learned to stack wheat sheaves so they'd shed rain. Learned the rhythm of agricultural labour that defined every frontier community. The work was brutal. You bent over wheat fields from dawn until dark. Your back screamed. Your hands blistered and bled and then calloused into something that barely felt human anymore. You breathed dust and chaff until your lungs rattled. You sweated through your shirt by 8 in the morning and worked in wet clothes until sunset because stopping to change wasn't an option. And at the end of the day, the farmer who hired you paid maybe 50 cents, maybe $1 if the harvest was good and he was feeling generous. You took your coins and walked home through twilight, too tired to think about tomorrow, and fell into bed knowing you'd do it all again in 6 hours. That was Cap's life. That was everyone's life. The frontier didn't have room for people who couldn't work themselves half to death 6 days a week. You either contributed to your family's survival, or you became a burden. And burdens didn't last long in a place where margins were measured in pounds of flour and degrees below zero. But Cap was good at this work, better than good. He had a gift for reading land and weather and understanding what crops needed before the crops knew they needed it. Farmers started asking for him specifically. Wanted the Garland boy because he didn't complain and didn't slack and could be trusted to work when nobody was watching. His sister Florence took a different path. By 1882, she was officially de Smet's first schoolteacher, setting up lessons in whatever building the town could spare, teaching children to read and write and do arithmetic while their parents worked themselves into early graves trying to make the prairie profitable. Florence represented something Cap never could. The civilizing influence, the intellectual frontier, the promise that Dakota Territory would eventually become more than just wheat fields and survival. That education mattered, that women could have professions, that the future might be different from the brutal present. But watching Florence succeed made something clear to Cap. His path wasn't going to be intellectual. It wasn't going to be respectable in the way teaching was respectable. He was built for physical labour, for dangerous work, for the kind of jobs that destroyed your body by 40, but paid enough that your family didn't starve. The seasons cycled. 1882 became 83, became 84. Cap grew into his frame, filled out. By the time he was 20, he was strong in the way frontiermen were strong, not gym muscular, work strong. The kind of strength that came from lifting grain sacks and wrestling plough horses, and spending every waking hour doing things that required your body to be a tool. And he was still that boy with the easy smile, still the one neighbours trusted, still the kid who rode through a blizzard to save to Smet. That story followed him everywhere. People introduced him as Cap Garland, the one who found wheat during the hard winter, like that was his full identity. Like nothing else he did would ever matter as much as that one ride when he was 16. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe the best thing Cap Garland would ever do happened before he was old enough to vote, before he understood that heroism was just luck, right place, right time, right combination of courage and stupidity that got you remembered instead of dead. But Cap didn't seem bitter about this, didn't resent being defined by one winter. He just kept working, kept showing up, kept being the reliable one, the steady one, the one farmers wanted on their crew when harvest came and time mattered, and mistakes meant losing a year's income to weather or spoilage. By 1885, something new was arriving on the Dakota prairie. You could hear it before you saw it, a sound like a train but smaller, more localized, the high-pitched shriek of steam escaping pressure valves, the rhythmic chug of pistons turning gears, the industrial revolution, portable and dangerous, coming to harvest wheat faster than human hands ever could. Steam threshing machines, they were magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Massive contraptions of iron and steam and rotating drums that could process in 3 days what took a crew of 20 men 3 weeks to do manually. They promised efficiency, progress, the future where farming would be profitable instead of just survivable. The first time Cap saw one, he was 20 years old, standing in a wheat field watching a crew set up the machine. The boiler alone was taller than a man, built from riveted iron plates, fed by coal or wood, until the internal pressure climbed high enough to drive the mechanical components. Steam hissed from joints. The whole thing radiated heat like a contained sun. And Cap Garland, who had spent 4 years doing back-breaking manual labour, understood immediately what this machine meant. It meant fewer workers needed. It meant the men who could operate these contraptions would earn more than the men who couldn't. It meant adapt or become obsolete. So he adapted. He walked up to the crew boss and asked to learn, said he was good with his hands, quick learner, willing to work for reduced wages while he figured out how the machine functioned. Learning to operate a steam thresher wasn't like learning to swing a scythe. His scythe could give you blisters. His steam thresher could kill you. The first lesson was respect. You didn't approach these machines casually, didn't lean against them or rest your hand on hot metal, or stand in the wrong place when the drum was rotating. Men who forgot these rules ended up missing fingers, or arms, or their lives. The boiler was the heart of the system and the most dangerous component. Water heated under pressure until it became steam. That steam, confined in iron, built pressure. That pressure, released through controlled valves, drove pistons and gears and rotating drums. But if something failed, if the boiler was overstoked or the pressure relief valve stuck or the metal developed a hairline crack from repeated heating and cooling, the result was catastrophic. Boiler explosions killed instantly. One moment you were standing there, the next moment superheated steam and shrapnel turned everything within 20 feet into a kill zone. Bodies were found scalded beyond recognition, thrown 40 feet by the force of the blast, burned so badly that identification required guessing based on what tools were found nearby. Cap learned this on his first day. The crew boss, a man named Henderson who'd been operating threshers for 6 years, walked him around the machine and pointed to every danger. The rotating drum that could catch loose clothing and pull you in before anyone could react. The drive belt that ran from engine to thresher, moving so fast it was invisible, capable of severing a limb if you stepped wrong. The steam exhaust that could scald your face if you stood downwind. Henderson had scars. Everyone on the crew had scars. Burns on forearms from accidentally touching hot pipes. Missing fingertips from mechanical accidents. One man had a permanent limp from when a drive shaft broke and the whipping metal caught his leg. But they all came back, season after season, because steam threshing paid 3 times what manual labour paid, because dangerous work was still work. Because on the frontier you took the jobs available and tried not to think about the men who died doing them. Cap was careful, methodical. He watched everything, learned the sounds the machine made when it was running correctly versus when something was wrong. The pitch of the steam exhaust, the rhythm of the threshing drum, the way the whole structure vibrated when everything was balanced. He developed an ear for trouble, could tell when the boiler was building too much pressure before the gauge showed red, could sense when a bearing was failing before it seized completely. Henderson noticed. By the end of that first harvest season, he offered Cap a permanent position on his crew, said the boy had instincts, said most operators took years to develop the kind of awareness Cap showed in months. Said if Cap wanted a future in mechanized agriculture, he had it. Cap took the job. Of course he did. It was more money than he'd ever made, more security than seasonal farm work offered, a skill that would be valuable as long as wheat needed threshing and machines needed operators. He was 21 years old, he had a profession, he had a future, and he had no idea that the thing he was learning to master would be the thing that killed him. The threshing crews were their own culture. You travelled together, lived in the same boarding houses or camped in the same fields, worked 16-hour days during harvest season, and then scattered during winter, when snow made threshing impossible. You developed the dark humour that all dangerous professions develop. Jokes about boiler explosions and missing limbs and the men who died doing this work before you. It was gallows humour. The kind that helped you climb back onto a machine after watching someone get hurt. The kind that let you sleep at night knowing tomorrow might be the day the boiler fails and you're standing in the wrong place. Cap fit into this world. He was still that easygoing kid, even at 23. Still quick to help when someone needed it. Still the one who volunteered for the most dangerous positions because someone had to do them, and it might as well be him. He worked the feed position mostly. That was where wheat sheaves got thrown into the threshing drum. You stood right next to the rotating mechanism, right where the noise was loudest and the danger was highest. If anything went wrong with the drum, if it seized or if a gear broke or if the drive belt snapped, you'd be the first to know because you'd be the first to die. But Cap was good at it. Fast, efficient. He could maintain a rhythm that kept the machine running at peak capacity without overloading it. The crew bosses loved him. Farmers requested him specifically, said their wheat got processed faster when the Garland boy was on the crew. By 1888, Cap was making more money than his father had ever made farming. He was 24. He was skilled. He was respected in his profession. He was exactly the kind of success story the frontier was supposed to produce. The boy who started with nothing and built a life through hard work and courage, and he had 3 years left to live. The machinery kept improving, kept getting bigger and more powerful and more dangerous. By 1890, the threshers could process entire fields in a single day. The boilers ran hotter, the drums spun faster. The pressure required to generate that kind of power pushed the equipment closer to its breaking point every season. November of 1891 came cold and early, the kind of cold that promised a brutal winter. Farmers were desperate to get their wheat threshed before snow made it impossible, before moisture ruined the grain, before they lost a year's income to weather they couldn't control. Henderson's crew was working 7 days a week, moving from farm to farm across Davison County. They'd thresh one property in a day and a half, tear down the equipment, haul it 5 miles to the next farm, set up again, and start over. The pace was brutal. The hours were worse. You worked until you couldn't see anymore, slept 4 hours, started again before dawn. Cap was exhausted. Everyone was exhausted. That's just how November worked in the threshing business. You pushed until the season ended, until snow forced you to stop, until the last farmer's wheat was processed and you could finally rest. On November 2nd, they finished the Morrison farm outside Huron. 20 acres of wheat turned into sacked grain in just under 2 days. Morrison paid in cash, fed the crew dinner, thanked them for working fast because he'd been worried about snow. Henderson announced they'd moved to the Badger Township location next. A farmer Cap didn't know, a property none of them had worked before. But the wheat was good and the pay was fair and the farmer needed them by November 3rd or he'd lose his grain to weather. Nobody questioned this. You went where the work was. You worked for whoever was paying. That's how seasonal labour functioned. They hauled the equipment through the night, used lanterns and moonlight and sheer determination to get the heavy machinery the 15 miles from Morrison's farm to Badger Township. By dawn on November 3rd, they were setting up in a field that looked like every other field they'd worked that season. Cap helped position the thresher, helped connect the drive belts, helped check all the mechanical connections to ensure nothing would fail under a load. This was routine. They'd done this setup 100 times. There was nothing special about this morning. Nothing that suggested today would be different from yesterday. Henderson fired the boiler at 6:30 in the morning, fed coal into the firebox, watched the pressure gauge climb, 20 pounds per square inch, 40, 60, 80. The machine needed 90 pounds to run efficiently. Needed that pressure to drive the mechanical components fast enough to thresh wheat at commercial speeds. The gauge climbed past 90, past 100. Henderson opened the throttle. Steam rushed through pipes. The drive shaft started turning. The threshing drum began to rotate. The whole massive structure shook itself awake, and Cap Garland took his position at the feeder. This was his job. This was what he'd done safely for 6 years. Stand here, grab wheat sheaves, throw them into the drum at the right rhythm. Keep the machine fed but not overloaded. Watch for jams. Listen for wrong sounds. Stay aware of everything, because staying aware kept you alive. The farmer and his sons brought the first wagon load of wheat at 7. Cap started feeding. The drum grabbed the sheaves and tore them apart. Grain separated from chaff. The machine did in minutes what would have taken hours by hand. This was progress. This was the future. This was why people adopted dangerous technology despite the risks. By 8 o'clock, they'd processed 3 wagon loads. By 9, 6. The rhythm was good. The machine was running clean. Henderson was satisfied with their pace. If they maintained this speed, they'd finish by evening, move to the next farm tomorrow, keep working until winter stopped them. Nobody noticed when the pressure gauge started climbing. Nobody heard the warning signs over the industrial roar of the thresher. Nobody saw the hairline crack in the boiler, where repeated heating and cooling had weakened the metal, just enough that structural failure became inevitable. At 9:43 in the morning on November the 3rd, 1891, the boiler exploded. The sound was like the earth splitting open, a crack so loud it echoed across the prairie. So loud that farmers 2 miles away heard it and knew immediately what had happened, because everyone in Dakota Territory knew that sound. The sound of steam escaping confinement, the sound of iron failing, the sound of men dying. Superheated steam and boiling water erupted outward. The blast wave knocked workers off their feet. Shrapnel from the destroyed boiler turned into projectiles. The entire machine, thousands of pounds of iron and wood, disintegrated into a debris field 40 feet across. Cap Garland was standing at the feeder position, right next to the boiler, right in the kill zone. He never had a chance to run. The force of the explosion threw him 15 feet. Steam scalded his body. His legs were shattered. And as he lay in that field, screaming in agony that no human should ever experience, Cap Garland finally understood the price of progress. The boy who survived the hard winter was dying on a beautiful November morning, and he had just enough time to realize it. The silence after a boiler explosion is worse than the noise, because the noise makes sense. Metal failing, steam escaping, the physical laws of pressure and heat doing what they do when containment fails. But the silence that follows is wrong. unnatural, the kind of quiet that comes when the world has just witnessed something it can't process. The other crew members were knocked down by the blast wave, thrown 10 feet, ears ringing, eyes blind from the steam cloud. When they could finally see again, when the superheated vapour cleared enough to reveal what was left, they found Cap Garland lying in a wheat field that had just become his deathbed, both legs shattered. You need to understand what that means in 1891 on the Dakota Prairie. Not broken, shattered. Bones splintered by the force of the explosion. Skin scalded by steam hot enough to cook flesh. And Cap was conscious, screaming. The kind of screaming that men who heard it would remember for the rest of their lives and wake up from nightmares decades later still hearing. Henderson ran to him first, dropped to his knees in the dirt beside the boy he'd trained, the boy who was careful and methodical and had 6 years of safe operation before this moment. And Henderson had to look at Cap's legs and know immediately that there was no fixing this. No doctor within 20 miles, no hospital, no morphine, no medical intervention that could save him. But you don't tell a dying man he's dying. You lie. You say help is coming. You say it'll be okay. You hold his hand and try not to let your face show what you're thinking. Someone rode for the nearest doctor. Someone else rode to notify Cap's family. The farmer whose wheat they were threshing stood there in shock, watching his field become a crime scene, watching a young man die because he needed his wheat processed before winter. Cap's mother Margaret received the news at home, a neighbour riding up fast, dismounting before the horse fully stopped, the kind of arrival that means something terrible has happened. She knew before he spoke. Mothers always know. She didn't scream, didn't faint. She grabbed her coat and demanded someone take her to her son, right now, immediately. Because if Cap was dying, he wouldn't die alone. He wouldn't die surrounded by strangers in a field where nobody loved him. The ride to Badger Township took an hour, the longest hour of Margaret Garland's life. She'd survived the Civil War era, survived multiple moves across the frontier, survived the long winter when everyone thought they'd starve, survived watching her children grow up in conditions that killed half the families who tried settling Dakota Territory. And now she was riding toward her son who'd saved the town at 16 and was dying at 26 because he was good with machinery and someone needed wheat threshed. When she arrived, Cap was still conscious, still in agony. The doctor hadn't arrived yet, wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, and when he did arrive, he'd take one look at Cap's injuries and know there was nothing to be done except wait. Margaret knelt beside her son in that field, held his hand, stroked his hair, spoke to him in the voice she'd used when he was small and scared of thunderstorms, told him he was brave, told him she was proud, told him all the things mothers tell their dying children when there's nothing else left to say. Cap died sometime that afternoon. The exact time isn't recorded. Nobody thought to check a watch. Nobody cared about documentation when a 26-year-old man was spending his last hours in pain no human should experience. The doctor arrived too late. He did what doctors did in that situation, signed a death certificate, listed cause of death as injuries sustained in threshing machine accident, gave the family his condolences, charged them for the house call anyway because that's how medical economics worked on the frontier. The crew packed up what was left of the thresher, loaded the destroyed boiler onto a wagon, cleaned up the debris field. By evening, the wheat field looked almost normal again, just dirt and stubble and the blood-soaked spot where Cap Garland died. By spring, new wheat would grow there. By next harvest, nobody would remember exactly where it happened. That's how quickly death becomes invisible on the frontier. One day you're a person with a name and a history, and a mother who loves you. The next day you're a cautionary tale, then a statistic, then forgotten entirely. The farmer finished his threshing with a different crew. Had to. The wheat couldn't wait for morning. Henderson's crew dissolved. Some men quit threshing entirely, said they'd rather make less money doing safer work. Others kept going because they had families to feed, and dangerous work was still work. Henderson himself would operate threshers for another 15 years before a different boiler explosion killed him in 1906. He'd think about Cap Garland often during those 15 years, wonder if there was something he missed, some warning sign, some way he could have prevented it. The answer was no. There was nothing he could have done. The machinery was dangerous by design, the safety regulations didn't exist, and men died because progress required bodies. Margaret Garland brought her son home, not to Badger Township, home to the Willow Lake area in Clark County, to Collins Cemetery where the family had burial plots, where Cap could rest near family, where she could visit him. The funeral was small. Frontier funerals always were. You notified who you could. People came if they could. You said prayers and sang hymns and buried the dead before winter made digging impossible. Florence Garland stood at her brother's graveside and tried to reconcile two versions of Cap. The boy who rode through blizzards at 16, and the man who died screaming in a wheat field at 26. Both true, both her brother. Both casualties of a frontier that demanded everything and gave back nothing but stories. She was 32 now, de Smet's first teacher, a professional woman, the kind of success story the frontier was supposed to produce. But standing there watching them lower Cap into the ground, Florence understood something about gender and survival that most people didn't see. She got to be remembered for her mind, for building institutions, for civilizing the prairie through education. Cap got remembered for his body, for physical courage, for the kind of labour that destroyed you by 40 if an accident didn't kill you first, and now he was dead, and she was alive, and there was no justice in it, just the random cruelty of a boiler that failed at the wrong moment with her brother standing in the wrong place. The gravestone they placed was simple, Oscar Edmund Garland. December 27th, 1864, November 3rd, 1891. 26 years. That's all the space a life gets reduced to. 2 dates, the mathematics of existence. Everything between them erased except what people choose to remember. De Smet remembered. For a while. People spoke about Cap in hushed tones. The hero of the long winter. The boy who saved us all. Killed by the very progress we claim to want. Some saw the irony. Most didn't. Most just shook their heads and said accidents happen, and moved on because dwelling on tragedy doesn't plough fields or harvest wheat. Laura Ingalls Wilder attended the funeral. She was 24 now, married to Almanzo, the man who rode alongside Cap during that famous wheat ride 10 years earlier, the man who became her husband. The man whose heroism she would later immortalise while Cap's name would barely appear in her published work. Did Laura think about that? Did she stand at Cap's grave and wonder why some stories survive while others vanish? Did she understand even then that history isn't what happened, but what gets written down and repeated until repetition becomes truth? We don't know. Laura didn't write about Cap's funeral, didn't mention his death in any of her memoirs. The boy who mattered so much in 1881 disappeared from her narrative by 1891. Not deliberately, not maliciously. Just the natural process of memory selecting what it needs and discarding the rest. The years passed. 1891 became 1900, became 1910. Cap's mother aged. His sister Florence continued teaching. The Garland family persisted, but Cap himself faded. Became that boy who died in a threshing accident, then that boy who died young, then just a name on a gravestone that fewer people visited each year. By 1920, most of de Smet's original settlers were dead or gone. The town had new people. People who didn't remember the long winter except as a story old-timers told. People who had no idea who Cap Garland was or why he mattered. His grave was maintained, but memory died faster than bodies did. Florence lived until 1935, 44 years after burying her brother. Long enough to see Dakota Territory become South Dakota, long enough to see automobiles replace horses, long enough to see the world transform from frontier to modern. She died having watched everything Cap knew become obsolete. And then something unexpected happened. In 1940, 49 years after Cap's death, a woman named Laura Ingalls Wilder published a book called The Long Winter. It was beautiful, powerful, a masterpiece of children's literature that would eventually sell millions of copies and be taught in schools and shape how Americans understood their frontier past. The book told the story of the winter of 1881, the blizzards, the starvation, the community survival, and at the climax, the heroic wheat ride that saved Smet. Almanzo Wilder was the hero. His courage, his determination, his willingness to risk death to save his neighbours. The book dedicated pages to describing his ride, made it mythic, made it the kind of story that children would read and think, that's what heroes look like. And Cap appeared as a nameless companion. Almanzo and another boy. That's how Laura wrote it. The most important thing Cap Garland ever did, and he didn't even get his name in the book that immortalized it. She didn't mention his death at all. Didn't tell readers that the brave boy who rode through blizzards died 10 years later in an industrial accident. Didn't connect the heroism to the tragedy. Didn't ask whether the same system that celebrated frontier courage also created the conditions that killed frontier workers. Maybe Laura didn't remember. 49 years is a long time. Memory fades. Details blur. The human brain selects what matters and discards the rest. Maybe by 1940, when Laura was writing her memoirs, Cap Garland was just a vague figure from her youth. Someone she knew once. Someone who mattered then but didn't fit the narrative she was constructing. Or maybe she remembered perfectly. Remembered his death. Remembered his funeral. Remembered the horror of watching a young man die from machinery that was supposed to make life easier, but chose not to include it because children's books aren't supposed to be that dark, aren't supposed to complicate the frontier mythology with inconvenient truths about industrial mortality. Either way, the result was the same. The Long Winter became one of the most beloved books in American literature, taught in classrooms across the country, made into television episodes, embedded in cultural memory as the definitive account of frontier survival, and Cap Garland was erased from his own story. That's how history works. Not through deliberate lies, but through selective truth. Laura Ingalls. Wilder didn't lie about Cap. She just didn't tell the whole story. Didn't think his death mattered to the narrative she was constructing. And because her version became canonical, because millions of people read her book and accepted it as history, Cap's sacrifice disappeared. Children learned about Almanzo Wilder's heroism. Nobody learned about Cap Garland's death. Nobody learned that steam threshing machines killed more Dakota Territory workers between 1880 and 1900 than all the famous gunfights and Indian conflicts combined. Nobody learned that industrial accidents were the real danger of the frontier, not the Wild West mythology that dominated popular imagination. By the time occupational safety regulations finally arrived in America, when OSHA was established in 1970, Cap Garland had been dead for 79 years. His death contributed nothing to worker safety, prompted no investigations, changed no policies, saved no future workers from the same fate. He died for nothing except proving that machinery designed without safety considerations will eventually kill the people operating it. His grave still exists in Collin Cemetery. You can visit it if you want. The stone is weathered now. The date's harder to read, but it's there. Physical proof that Oscar Edmund Garland existed, was born, died, mattered to someone even if he didn't matter to history. In recent decades, something interesting has happened. Laura Ingalls Wilder scholarship has exploded. Academics and fans have gone back through her books, comparing them to historical records. Trying to separate fact from fiction, trying to understand what really happened versus what Laura chose to tell. And in that process, they rediscovered Cap Garland, found his birth certificate, his death certificate, his grave, newspaper accounts that mentioned him, genealogy records that traced his family. Slowly, piece by piece, researchers have reconstructed his life, given him back the name that Laura's book took away. But this recovery is happening in genealogy websites and academic papers and blog posts, not in classrooms, not in popular culture. The Long Winter is still the version most people know, the version where Almanzo is the hero and Cap is an unnamed companion. the version where the story ends with survival and doesn't mention the industrial death that followed. So what do we do with this? What does Cap Garland's story teach us about how we remember the past? First, that heroism doesn't protect you. Cap proved his courage at 16, earned his community's gratitude, established himself as someone who would risk everything to help others, and none of that mattered when the boiler exploded. Courage can't stop steam pressure, can't prevent metal fatigue, can't save you from machinery designed to maximize profit rather than worker safety. Second, that memory is selective and political. Laura Ingalls Wilder wasn't trying to erase Cap, but her narrative choices had consequences. By centering Almanzo and marginalizing Cap, she created a version of history that felt cleaner, more heroic, more aligned with American frontier mythology. The messiness of industrial death didn't fit that narrative, so it got excluded. Third, that the victims of technological progress are forgotten while the technology is celebrated. We remember steam threshers as innovation, as the mechanization that made American agriculture profitable. We don't remember the thousands of workers those machines killed. Don't memorialize them, don't teach their names. They're just the cost of doing business, the acceptable casualties of progress. And finally, that individual deaths only matter if someone tells their story. Cap died alone in a field surrounded by strangers. His mother held him. His sister mourned him. But his story could have ended there. Could have been just another forgotten grave in a prairie cemetery. The only reason we know about him at all is because Laura Ingalls Wilder mentioned the wheat ride in her book, even though she didn't name him. Even though she erased his death. That brief mention was enough to give researchers a thread to pull, a way back to the real Cap Garland. Margaret Garland died not knowing her son would be rediscovered. She carried her grief to her own grave, visited Cap's marker for decades, remembered him fully, completely, as the child she raised and the man he became and the tragedy of his death. But her memory died with her. The only memory that survived was the one Laura chose to preserve, incomplete, simplified, stripped of its darkest truth. That's what we lost when Cap Garland died in 1891. Not just a 26-year-old man, not just a hero of the long winter, but the chance to remember frontier history honestly, to acknowledge that progress has a body count, to understand that the same forces that built America also killed the people doing the building. Cap Garland deserved better, deserved to be remembered fully, deserved to have his story told without erasure or simplification. This is that story. This is the truth that Laura Ingalls Wilder couldn't or wouldn't tell. The boy who saved Smet died because machinery mattered more than workers, and nobody with power cared enough to change it. Margaret Garland died not knowing her son would be rediscovered. She carried her grief to her own grave, visited Cap's marker for decades, remembered him fully, completely, as the child she raised and the man he became and the tragedy of his death. But her memory died with her. The only memory that survived was the one Laura chose to preserve, incomplete, simplified, stripped of its darkest truth. That's what we lost when Cap Garland died in 1891. Not just a 26-year-old man, not just a hero of the long winter, but the chance to remember frontier history honestly, to acknowledge that progress has a body count, to understand that the same forces that built America also killed the people doing the building. Cap Garland deserved better, deserved to be remembered fully, deserved to have his story told without erasure or simplification. But here's what nobody talks about when they tell frontier stories. Here's what gets left out of the Little House books, and the history textbooks, and the romanticized narratives about westward expansion. When men like Cap died, they didn't die alone. Cap Garland didn't have a wife, didn't have children, so when he died, there were no immediate orphans. No widow left destitute. His death was contained to his parents and siblings, a family tragedy, not a social catastrophe. But he was the exception. Most of the men who died in threshing accidents between 1880 and 1900 had families, had wives who depended on their income, had children who needed feeding. And when those men died, their families didn't just lose a father, They lost everything. Because here's what frontier economics looked like for working families. The man earned wages, the woman managed the household and raised children. If you lost the wage earner, you lost your ability to pay rent, to buy food, to survive. There was no workers' compensation in 1891, no life insurance for labourers, no government safety net, no unemployment benefits. When your husband died in an industrial accident, you received exactly nothing except condolences and maybe some charity from your church if you were lucky. Women had 3 options: remarry quickly before your money ran out, find work yourself, which meant leaving your children somewhere while you worked for wages that were a fraction of what men earned, or watch your children starve. And if you couldn't manage any of those options, if you were too old to remarry, too unskilled to find work, too desperate to keep your family together, your children were taken, not violently, not all at once, but systematically, quietly, through a process that called itself charity but functioned like erasure. Workhouses would come for them first, orphanages run by churches or charitable organisations, places that promised to feed and clothe and educate children whose mothers couldn't afford to keep them, places that separated siblings, that stripped children of their names and their histories and their connection to family. And then, if you were truly unlucky, if your children ended up in the wrong institution at the wrong time, they might be loaded onto a train and shipped west, given to farmers who needed labour, adopted by families who might love them or might work them to death, sent to places so far from home that they'd never find their way back. Between 1854 and 1929, over 250,000 children were displaced this way. Orphan trains, they called them, the largest child migration in American history. Children whose fathers died in factory accidents and mine collapses and threshing machine explosions, just like the one that killed Cap Garland. Nobody connected these dots. Nobody looked at the thousands of men dying in industrial accidents and asked what happened to their children. Nobody counted the families destroyed by machinery that prioritized profit over safety. Nobody acknowledged that every worker's death created ripples that extended far beyond the man who died. Margaret Garland was spared this fate. Cap wasn't married, wasn't supporting a family. His death didn't orphan anyone. But across Dakota Territory, across the entire industrializing nation, other mothers watched their husbands die, and then watched their children disappear into a system that broke families as efficiently as machinery broke bodies. This is the story that doesn't get told, the story Laura Ingalls Wilder couldn't or wouldn't write, the story that disrupts the narrative of American progress and westward expansion and frontier triumph. Because if you tell this story honestly, if you follow the thread from Cap Garland's death to the children orphaned by industrial accidents, to the trains that shipped those children west to be labourers on farms that needed cheap workers, you have to confront something uncomfortable. You have to admit that the frontier wasn't won through courage and determination. It was built on bodies, adult bodies like Cap's, destroyed by dangerous machinery. Child bodies sent west to work in conditions that killed them before they reached adulthood. Native bodies, displaced and destroyed to make room for settlers. Immigrant bodies, worked to death in mines and factories and fields. The wheat that saved Smet during the long winter. It required threshers. Threshers required operators. Operators died at rates we can barely document because their deaths were considered personal tragedies, not policy failures. The farms that needed children from orphan trains, they existed because industrialization created a demand for agricultural workers that couldn't be met through immigration alone. So they imported children, gave them new names, worked them like adults, and if those children died, well, there were always more children whose fathers had died in accidents. While Cap was learning to operate steam threshers that would eventually kill him, his sister Florence was building a different kind of legacy. One that wouldn't get her killed but would be just as quickly forgotten. Florence Adelia Garland lived until 1935, 44 years longer than her brother. Long enough to see the entire world transform. Long enough to teach hundreds of children in Smet. Long enough to watch the frontier become civilization and wonder if the price was worth it. She never wrote a memoir, never published her story, never got the chance to tell anyone what it was like to be de Smet's first teacher, to watch her community survive the long winter, to bury her brother when he was 26, to live through everything Cap missed. Her story survives in fragments. Census records that list her occupation as teacher, marriage records showing she married someone named Dawley, genealogy websites maintained by descendants who know her name but not her life. This is what happens to women's stories on the frontier. They disappear. Not because women didn't matter, not because they weren't doing important work, but because the narratives we tell about the West prioritize men's stories, men's heroism, men's labour, men's deaths. Florence educated an entire generation of de Smet children. That's significant. That's the kind of contribution that shapes communities for decades. But it's invisible work, quiet work, the kind that doesn't make for dramatic storytelling, the kind that gets footnoted in histories focused on men who rode through blizzards or died in explosions. And here's the cruel irony. Florence's work was safer than Cap's. Teaching didn't involve boilers that could explode. Didn't require operating dangerous machinery. Didn't expose her to industrial hazards that killed without warning. But teaching also paid less. Much less. Women's work always paid less, even when it required education and skill and dedication. Even when it was crucial to community development. Even when it was objectively safer and more sustainable than the dangerous labour men were expected to perform. Florence couldn't have supported a family on a teacher's salary. Couldn't have been the breadwinner the way Cap could have been if he'd survived. The economic system that made dangerous male labour valuable and safe female labour expendable was the same system that killed her brother. She understood this, had to understand it. Watch Cap take increasingly dangerous jobs because they paid better. Watched him learn to operate machinery that terrified everyone who saw it. Watched him trade safety for wages because that's what men did on the frontier. And then she buried him and kept teaching. Because what else could she do? Grief doesn't excuse you from work, doesn't make children any less in need of education, doesn't change the fact that your community needs you. Florence lived through both world wars, saw automobiles replace horses, saw electricity come to rural South Dakota, saw women gain the right to vote, saw everything her brother missed because he died at 26 in a wheat field. Did she think about him? Of course, every day, probably. Every time she taught a boy who reminded her of Cap. Every time November rolled around. Every time she visited his grave and stood there wondering what he would have become if the boiler hadn't exploded. But she never wrote it down. Never created a record that historians could analyse. Never left behind anything except her name in official documents and the vague memory that she was de Smet's first teacher. That's the shadow story. The story of women who survived while men died. Who built institutions while men built legends. Who remembered while men were forgotten. Who carried grief privately while public memory focused elsewhere. Florence Garland mattered. Her work mattered. Her survival mattered. But history didn't preserve her story the way it preserved Cap's heroism, didn't give her the documentation she deserved, didn't recognise that frontier women's labour was just as crucial as frontier men's sacrifice. So what do we do with all this? What do we owe to Cap Garland and the thousands of workers like him who died building industrial America? We owe them memory. Complete memory. Not the sanitised version. Not the heroic narrative that ends with the wheat ride and never mentions the explosion. Not the frontier mythology that celebrates courage while ignoring the structural conditions that made courage necessary. We owe them the acknowledgement that their deaths weren't inevitable, weren't natural, weren't just the price of progress. Safety improvements were technically possible in 1891. Boilers could have been built with better pressure relief valves. Machinery could have been designed with guards and emergency stops. Training standards could have been established. Regulations could have been enforced. But all of that cost money, reduced profit margins, slowed production, so it didn't happen. And men died, and their deaths were blamed on individual carelessness instead of systemic negligence. And nothing changed until enough workers organised and fought and died that the government finally created OSHA, in 1970. Cap Garland died 79 years before workplace safety regulations became federal law. His death contributed nothing to that change, taught nobody anything, changed no policies, saved no future workers. That's the tragedy. Not just that he died, but that he died for nothing. His sacrifice brought nothing except his employer's continued profit and his family's grief. We owe him the truth, that the frontier wasn't romantic, that progress has a body count, that the same industrial revolution that made America wealthy also killed thousands of workers whose names we don't remember, and whose deaths we never counted. We owe him the connection between his death and all the deaths that followed. The children orphaned by industrial accidents, the families destroyed by economic systems that valued profit over safety, the communities torn apart by tragedies that could have been prevented. And we owe him the recognition that his story isn't unique, isn't exceptional, isn't notable except for the accident of Laura Ingalls Wilder mentioning him in passing in a book published 49 years after his death. Thousands of men died the way Cap died, in explosions, in mechanical accidents, in workplace disasters that were called tragedies but were actually murders by negligence. And almost none of them are remembered. Almost none of their stories survive. Almost none of their families got justice. Cap Garland gets remembered because Laura wrote about the wheat ride, because researchers connected her book to historical records, because enough documentation survived that we can reconstruct his life. But what about the men whose names never appeared in books, whose deaths weren't documented, whose families couldn't afford gravestones, whose children were shipped west on orphan trains and lost their connection to family history entirely? They died too, just as violently, just as unnecessarily, just as forgotten. We owe them all memory, all of them, the named and the nameless, the documented and the lost, the heroes and the ordinary workers who died doing jobs that needed doing. That's what this story is really about. Not just Cap Garland, but everyone like him, everyone who built industrial America with their labour and paid for it with their lives, everyone whose death was treated as personal tragedy instead of policy failure, everyone who deserved better than they got. But there's one more thread to pull, one more story that connects to Cap's death in ways nobody wanted to acknowledge at the time. When Cap died in that wheat field in November of 1891, he left no children behind. But the system that killed him created children who needed somewhere to go, children whose fathers died in identical accidents, children whose mothers couldn't support them alone, children who became statistics in the largest forced migration of young people in American history. The orphan train started in 1854, 37 years before Cap's death, but they accelerated through the 1880s and 90s as industrialization killed more workers and created more orphans than the system knew how to handle. Between 1854 and 1929, over 250,000 children were loaded onto trains and shipped west, given to families they'd never met, separated from siblings, told they were lucky to have this opportunity, told they should be grateful. Some were orphans in the traditional sense, both parents dead, no family left, genuinely alone in the world, but many weren't. Many had mothers who were still alive but too poor to feed them, had fathers who died in industrial accidents just like Cap's, had been taken by charitable organisations that decided poverty was a good enough reason to break up families. The frontier needed these children, needed their labour. Farms were expanding, towns were growing. There weren't enough workers to do all the jobs that needed doing, so America imported children, called it charity, called it giving them a better life, called it anything except what it was, creating a labour force from the children of dead workers. And here's where Cap's story connects to something larger, something darker, something that reveals how industrial America functioned in the decades before anyone cared about safety or justice, or whether breaking up families might not be the best solution to poverty. The same economic forces that made steam threshers profitable, despite their danger, also made orphan trains necessary. The same system that killed Cap created the children who needed rescuing. The same industrial revolution that built American wealth also destroyed the families of the workers who made it possible. Nobody drew this connection at the time, Nobody looked at orphan trains and asked why there were so many orphans. Nobody connected industrial mortality to family separation. Nobody wondered if maybe, just maybe, the solution to orphaned children wasn't shipping them west, but making the jobs that killed their fathers safe enough that fathers survived. That would have required changing everything, redesigning machinery, enforcing regulations, prioritizing worker safety over profit margins, acknowledging that human life had value beyond its productive capacity. America wasn't ready for that conversation in 1891. Wouldn't be ready for decades. Would need unions and reformers and progressives and investigative journalists and countless more deaths before anything changed. So, the orphan trains kept running, kept collecting children whose fathers had died building railroads and mining coal and operating threshers and working in factories, kept shipping them west to become farm labour and domestic servants, and adopted children who never saw their birth families again. By the time the last orphan train ran in 1929, over 250,000 children had been displaced. Some thrived, found loving families, built good lives, considered themselves lucky. Others didn't, were abused, or worked like slaves, died young from overwork or accident or disease. Spent their entire lives wondering who they really were and where they really came from and why they'd been taken from their families, and at the root of it all, buried in the foundation of this massive social program that we now recognise as deeply problematic, were men like Cap Garland, men who died in industrial accidents, men whose deaths created the orphans, men whose deaths were never connected to the consequences that followed. That's the story nobody tells. That's the thread that connects the heroic wheat ride to the orphan trains, to the Industrial Revolution, to the building of modern America. It's all connected. All part of the same system, all built on the same foundation of bodies and broken families and children sent away to places they didn't choose. Cap Garland died believing his work mattered, believing he was building something, contributing to progress, helping his community survive and thrive. He was. But the cost was higher than anyone admitted, and the consequences reached further than anyone wanted to acknowledge. That's the truth about the American frontier, about industrial America, about progress itself. It's built on sacrifice, some of it voluntary, most of it not. All of it necessary only because we chose profit over safety, growth over sustainability, expansion over the lives of the people doing the expanding. Cap Garland deserved better. So did the 250,000 children who rode orphan trains west because their fathers died in accidents that could have been prevented. They all deserved better, and maybe, just maybe, by remembering their stories, we can make sure future generations get what they all deserved, the truth. But this is just one story of the frontier's hidden costs. The orphan trains carried 250,000 children west between 1854 and 1929. Children torn from their families, given new names, sent to strangers, some found love, others found horror, and almost none of them ever saw their birth families again. That story, the largest forced child migration in American history, is one that nobody wanted to remember. Until now. Next time, we're boarding those trains, we're following those children, and we're uncovering the truth about what happened when America decided that breaking up poor families was charity. You won't believe what we found.